Hello and welcome to today's video. In today's video, I want to put together the ideas of prisoner's dilemma, the ideas of rational choice theory, into the theory of neorealism. We've been talking about prisoner's dilemma and the notion of rational choice theory because they are the constituent parts of this theory. Neorealism is a theory associated with the thinker Kenneth Waltz, one of the more significant figures in modern international relations. Waltz argued that international relations theorists that had spoken about human nature, like realism and idealism, were just looking in the wrong place in order to understand how the world worked. They had to look not at human nature in terms of good and bad, but at people in terms of their being rational. And because people were rational, they were essentially all the same, and their behaviour, Waltz thought, was incredibly predictable. And that behaviour was determined by the circumstances they were put in. And so neorealism is based upon this micro assumption of individual rationality, but it's really interested in the macro level of understanding things. Because people are individually rational, they're very predictable, and their behaviour is determined by their macro circumstances. In the same way as Mr. A and Mr. B's behaviour was determined by the situation they were put in, so is the behaviour of states, Waltz and neorealists argue, determined by the situation they're put in. It really doesn't matter, neorealists argue, who leads states. It really doesn't matter what domestic political system states have. It doesn't matter who leads these states, and it doesn't matter what kind of politics they have internally, because they're led by people, and people are assumed to be rational in this theory. So what states are going to do, given that states are rational actors, is respond to the pattern of incentives and disincentives that exists in their environment, in what Waltz and neorealists call the international system. This international system is going to incentivize some types of behaviour and disincentivize other types of behaviour, and states are going to respond accordingly. So neorealists argue that states all want basically the same thing, which is to protect their security. They protect their security by having enough power in order to ensure that they can't be easily conquered and they can pursue their goals. The system makes it rational for states to want to protect their security because the system is one in which all states want the same thing and all states are basically on the same level. There's no one in charge. There's no equivalent of the authorities in the international system. Things like the League of Nations or the United Nations, for realists and again here for neorealists, don't really work and don't really exert any impact on what happens in international politics. The system is what's called anarchic. No one is in charge and everyone wants the same thing, which is to be secure. Therefore, in an anarchic system full of actors who have the goal of being secure, that is a system that will promote self-help behaviour. Simply put, you have to help yourself in such a situation because there's no one else to help you. Your rational strategy is going to be to take care of your own business. So state behaviour in this situation will be security seeking because states are rational, not because they're good or bad, and it will be what's called zero sum. Zero sum means that if I gain something, you lose something. There is only so much of that thing to go around. By working together, we can't increase the amount of the thing. We can't work as a team and increase the total amount of the thing to be distributed. And so, if the amount of the thing is fixed, the more I get, the less you get, and vice versa. Security in international politics, neorealists argue, is a zero-sum situation. If I make myself more secure, I'm going to make you less secure. I might think I'm getting stronger in order to just make myself more secure, and I'm really not interested in attacking you. I'm not interested in reducing your security. However, because we exist in the same system, I inevitably reduce your security when I increase my security. If I become 1 point more secure, you become 1 point less secure. And this, for neorealists, is the core problem of international politics. That states behaving rationally seek to make themselves more secure, they seek to acquire enough power that they can help themselves, but in so doing, they make other states insecure. And of course, those other states, responding rationally, will seek to acquire more power themselves, to rectify this situation, to get their security back, and both sides therefore make themselves less secure. This is, of course, the tragedy of Mr. A and Mr. B, who, if they'd worked together, could have walked out of the police station, but they sold each other out, not because they're bad, but because of the situation they're put in. So for neorealists, none of this ever changes. People are always rational. That's the core world-building assumption of neorealist theory. That's the world they think we live in. That's the world they tell stories in. People being rational, states being led by rational people, and existing in an anarchic system, a self-help system, are therefore always going to behave in security-seeking ways. And those security-seeking ways are always going to provoke a counter-reaction from other states who will behave equally rationally in trying to advance their own security. This is just baked into the situation states are in, neorealists think, and it's not really a changeable situation. In fact, for neorealists, nothing much ever changes in international politics. So you might think this is a very static theory, maybe even a very boring theory, and you might also think things do happen in international politics. Situations do look different from one another. World War II was not the same as the Cold War. The Cold War was not the same as the First World War. The situation we're in now is not the same as the Cold War. So it's true that neorealists think almost nothing changes in international politics that could explain that kind of variation. But neorealists think one thing does change, and it's very important to understand what's going on. Neorealists think the one thing that does change is the number of great powers there are in the international system. A great power for a neorealist is any state that cannot be conquered by any other state acting alone. Situations in which there are different numbers of great powers create pretty different incentives, both for the great powers themselves and for the other states in the system. And so situations or eras with more or less great powers are going to exhibit some different dynamics of behaviour in international politics. Let's talk about 4 configurations in terms of the number of great powers and what impact neorealists think they have on the way that international politics works. Neorealists like to talk about great powers through a concept of polarity. They say great powers are like poles of the system. How many poles there are in a system at any given time is going to be the defining characteristic of that system. And so when there's one great power, neorealists call this a unipolar system, one pole of the system. In a unipolar system, there are some specific dynamics. First of all, if you're the one great power in the unipolar system, the hegemon, you're the most secure state in the system. It's not a bad system for you to be in. However, there are some risks. In particular, if you're the unipolar state and there are no other great powers around, your calculations of what are risky and prudent foreign policies might get a bit distorted because you're not really getting good feedback from the system on what are risky and what are sensible policies, because there's no one with power enough to challenge you anyway. If you're the most powerful person in a situation, you can do a lot of pretty stupid stuff before someone says, stop doing those stupid things. So there's a risk in a unipolar system of the one great power, the unipolar state, overextending itself. Perhaps it seeks too much security and it goes around trying to eliminate even quite minor security threats, and it exhausts itself. The other risk for the unipolar state is that every other state in the system has a strong incentive to balance it, to make themselves more powerful, to cut the one great power down to size. Now that's not going to be very effective at first, because by definition, every state in the system that's not the one great power is too weak to really affect what's going on. But over time, smaller powers within the system can exhaust or frustrate or trip up the great power. They can make it more and more difficult for that great power to exercise leadership, and eventually, combined with the great power's incentives or tendencies to overreach, to overreact to small security threats, the unipolar system is likely to change. The one great power is likely to fall or at least be reduced in relative power, and the system's going to change into a different type of system. In fact, neorealists say unipolar systems are not particularly long-lasting. They're likely to change into a different type of system. If another great power arises, we'd call this a bipolar international system. In a bipolar system, there are 2 great powers. It was the bipolar system of the Cold War that gave Kenneth Waltz the idea for neorealism. He asked himself why, given that the United States and the Soviet Union had so many traditional reasons to go to war with one another, they hadn't actually gone to war with one another. Walzer's conclusion was that bipolar systems offer both of the great powers in the system a pretty simple decision-making context that makes rational decision, rationally calculating the costs and benefits of any form of action, makes these rational decisions pretty easy to make, because you only really need to think about one other state. The third system that neorealists talk about is one with three great powers. They call this tripolarity. Tripolar systems are pretty rare, and they're often seen to be pretty dangerous. This is because of the rule of three. You can't balance a social circumstance where there are three. You can't just balance against one other person. You can't form teams of two. There's always going to be an imbalance with two on one side and one on the other. And these imbalances are going to provide incentives towards aggression. And incentives toward aggression are going to lead to an unstable system, and they're going to lead to a higher instance of war. Finally, if there are four or more great powers in the international system, neorealists would call this multipolar. In a multipolar system, the way to assure security is going to be by forming alliances with other states. You've got to be worried about standing alone as a great power, because you could be conquered by an alliance of 2, 3, or even 4 other great powers. You should try to ensure that you form an alliance that's roughly equal in power to another alliance in the system. This is an area where neorealists differ from their older cousins, realists, because neorealists think that multipolar systems are pretty unstable, and they're definitely inferior to bipolar systems if the goal is peace. Realists, on the other hand, really liked multipolar systems. Why the difference? Well, for old-style realists, multipolar systems were pretty stable because you always had options over who to ally with. There were enough states in the system that were consequential that you could make an alliance that makes sense and keep the system in relative balance. Neorealists, though, thought multipolar systems were very dangerous. And they were dangerous because the more allies you had, the more likely you were to get dragged into a war on their behalf that you may have rationally calculated is not in your interests. In a bipolar system, if you're one of the great powers, you can ignore your allies. You can let them fall if you need to, because they're not consequential enough to make a material difference to the overall balance of power in the system anyway. But if you're one of the allies in a multipolar system, you have to fight on behalf of your allies. If you lose your allies, you're left pretty vulnerable. So now we've looked at neorealism. Many of the same concepts, rationality and the importance of system, are going to be important for the next theory we look at, neoliberalism. But that's a story for next time.
I would go out tonight, but I haven't got a stitch to wear.
Mercy. Mercy.
This charming man is about being charming, which so very few people are these days.